You're listening to episode 162 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Ronald Epstein joins us to speak about attending, medicine, mindfulness, and humanity. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this can only be sustained with your generosity. Please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com, and click on Make a Donation if you value these conversations, which can't continue without your contributions. Thank you for your help and your support. When I was little, the medical profession seemed very removed from human experience. It was clinical and antiseptic, not just medically, but personally. It seems there is a shift to acknowledging and even working with the mental and emotional side of the equation too, but that requires some understanding, and mindfulness can help. Ronald M. Epstein is a family physician, palliative care physician, writer, researcher, and teacher of communication and mindful practice in medicine. Our guest today is Ronald M. Epstein. Ron, thank you so much for being here. Nice to meet you.
It's really a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So glad you're here. So let's begin. We'll get to our main topic, which is your book called Attending, Medicine, Mindfulness, and Humanity. But let's start by just having you tell us a bit about your background.
Oh boy. Well, where do you want me to begin? So,
whatever is appropriate for you, and take your time.
Right. Well, I'm trying to think back when my first introduction to the world of the mind was, and before the word mindfulness had really gotten out into the public sphere. And I think it was about when I was 8. I had asthma when I was a kid, and there weren't very good medicines. And so I spent a lot of my childhood coughing and feeling short of breath. And it was never severe, but it was enough to be uncomfortable. And then at a certain point, I recall discovering that if I could lie down perfectly still and breathe not too deeply, just kind of shallowly, and could tolerate that very slight sense of not getting enough oxygen, that I could feel a sense of calm and I wouldn't cough, and eventually my breathing would feel more comfortable. So I wasn't really doing anything about the bronchospasm in my airways, but I was doing something about the way I could tolerate it. And I just only realized that in retrospect, that what I was doing was probably a kind of meditation. It was a kind of activity of the mind in which I was aware of my body as a whole, setting aside judgments about comfort and discomfort, and really being present in the moment. And I know that every time I kind of recall that when I lost my sense of focus, then I would feel uncomfortable. My breathing would, even though I wasn't getting any more or less oxygen, it somehow was unpleasant. So in a way, it's hard for me to talk about the before and after. I know people say, well, they discovered mindfulness and then their life was somehow different. And for me, that's just not the story that I can tell. I think that has been with me always, and then I just had different names for it. And I was always interested in the body and the mind and the connection between the two of them in a philosophical way as well as a pragmatic way. And I did a lot of things before I ended up in medical school. I studied Chinese medicine, studied Chinese philosophy, spent some time studying Zen Buddhism, spent some time at a Zen center in San Francisco. And I think it wasn't really until after, and I continued to practice through that time, but it wasn't until several years after I finished my medical training that it began to occur to me that the same quality of mind that I would have in meditation was quite similar to the quality of mind I would have. I play music, I'm a musician. So when I was playing music, and also that quality of mind when I was really at the top of my game as a doctor. And most doctors will tell you that you do medical school and residency, but you don't really feel like your training is done until about 5 or 10 years later. That it just takes a while to grow into the role and feel comfortable with all of the uncertainties, and that was certainly true for me as well. So coinciding with that time was this growing sense that this inner life that I had discovered through meditation and various other ways had relevance to the training of doctors. And that's when I began speaking and talking about mindfulness in medicine. So that was around the late 1990s, so maybe 22, 24 years ago. So a long time.
So then, fast forwarding to more recently, what led you to writing a book about it? What led you to writing Attending?
Well, I first published a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1999 called Mindful Practice. And for me, it was a kind of personal manifesto. I wrote it not half expecting it wouldn't be published, it would just be a personal document. And I sent it to JAMA, and luck would have it that a really sympathetic editor saw it and saw the potential in it, and it went back and forth a number of times and ultimately was published. And for me, that was a huge career inflection. It was a big change because I started receiving correspondence by mail. I mean, it's only 21 years ago, but people still actually communicated writing letters
Yeah.
that you get in the mail, in the mailbox. It wasn't all email. So I got several hundred letters from doctors around the country and around the world, and also other non-doctors who were involved in the training of physicians, saying, yes, this is a truth that needs to be out there. This reflects what I think is important as the heart and soul of medicine. And for me, that was just incredibly validating. So then the question was, what next? Like, how do you take this? I was very much involved in medical student education, and I thought, well, maybe you should require that before applying to medical school, everyone have 8 years of meditation experience. And well, no, that's not really practical. That would be kind of a non-starter, right? It'd be nice, but and now it's kind of interesting because when I'm with groups of medical students and I ask how many of you have ever done some kind of meditation or contemplative practice, like 2/3 of them raise their hand. It's not that they're practicing every day, but it's part of their lexicon. It's part of their life experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. I asked that same question in the beginning of a lot of my talks and presentations. And 5 years ago, almost no hands would have gone up. And in the most recent in person, absolutely everyone's hand went up. So yeah, it shifted dramatically in the past few years.
It's a huge culture change. And so this is, and when I speak to audiences of physicians, what previously seemed outrageous and mystical and inaccessible now seems like, well, what else is new? So people know the word mindfulness, and it generally has positive valence. So I know I'm digressing from your question about why the book.
Mm.
So I wrote a proposal to a publisher in the year 2001. So this is 2 years after the paper was written, along with a sample chapter or two. And I got these reviews back from the editors saying, well, is there, is mindfulness in the public media? Is there a journal of mindfulness? Is there, this is just not an idea that's going to have legs. This is just something that's out there and doesn't really have a future.
Mm.
And right. So I stuck it in a drawer for a while, and then I had a sabbatical a few years later and started writing again. And a variety of things happened, and I didn't. So the book really had a long gestation. And then finally, when I saw that my 60th birthday was looming within a few years, I came to realize that if I didn't write this book now, it might never get written. And there's a certain urgency when you realize that you're not going to live forever. And I know we all know we're not going to live forever, but it does, for me, it didn't really hit me in the face until I was in my mid 50s. And so then this urgency took over, and then just gratitude to a number of people who encouraged me at that point. Pauline Chen used to write columns for the New York Times, and she attended 2 of our workshops and was enamored with the mindful practice training we were doing for physicians. I say we because Nick Krasner and I created that program. And we had a kind of heart-to-heart conversation, and she said, well, you could write another article and it might be published in the New England Journal or JAMA, but if you really want to change the world, you need to write a book, and you need to write a book that the general public will read. And I'd never done that before. I had written a couple hundred articles for academic medical journals in that particular restrictive style,
Mm-hmm.
and a few thought pieces and more creative things. But the idea of writing a book, and a book for the general public, was like, well, can I do this? And for me, it was a real learning curve, because when you write academic articles, people kind of have to read them if they're in their field, right? But when you write a book, people don't have to read it. They pick it up, they read a couple pages in the bookstore or online, and then they decide if it really captivates their interest. So that was one challenge. And the second challenge was that generally in the academic world, you present ideas and then you give a few examples of the idea. But when you're writing a book, you have to show people things rather than tell them. So stories really are really what it's about. And then you bring people in through the way that you craft stories. And when done well, you don't need to then provide a summary or an idea or an exposition. That somehow flows directly from the narrative. And so for me, that was an interesting challenge.
And it is a very different writing style from doing a research paper, as you said, that people have to read, but that the general public may not grasp anyway because of the jargon that is the lingua franca of that particular discipline, that is just very different than how people may speak. And that's why it's so wonderful to be able to have this opportunity in speaking with researchers in particular, because they can give a regular human voice to what will be a research paper that people, general public, isn't going to read. And so the same thing with your book for the popular media. It's a different way to write.
So whenever I had one of my researchy ideas, I would kind of write it into the book, and then I would extract it and make it a footnote. And so because I couldn't quite give up on, and I think it's important also for people to know that these are not just things that are my truth, my own intuitions, or these are things that have some scientific basis, some validation. And of course, everyone puts those data together a little bit differently, but in my own mind, I was weaving stories that were informed by what I knew about how the brain works, what the mind is, how people communicate, what well-being is for a health professional, what flourishing means as a professional, those kinds of things. So that was really in the back of my mind while I was telling stories.
And is that the structure of the book? Is it foundationally based in stories and then discussion?
A lot of it is, yeah. I mean, a lot of it is stories, sometimes from a long time ago when I was a medical student, some more recent, some having to do with patients that I took care of, some having to do with colleagues that I've known. I think the basis of the book, the ideas do spring from stories, and to try to make them accessible so that anyone reading them could say, oh yeah, I understand what's going on here. I can understand how that surgeon might have made a mistake. And I don't know all the anatomy and what's going on inside the body, but I understand that state of mind that can make you so narrowly focused that your peripheral vision just isn't working. I think we can all relate to that, and so bringing the importance of self-awareness and mindfulness in healthcare in such a way that not only health professionals could understand it, but also the general public. I mean, we all, whether we want to or not, have interactions with the healthcare system in some way, and sometimes more than we want to. So I think that's the common ground that I was seeking.
So I'm wondering, what are some of the ways in which you have found mindfulness particularly applying to the field of medicine, knowing that, of course, it can touch absolutely everything. But what are some of the things that stand out for you most, where certain aspects of mindfulness can really be beneficial?
Yeah. I'll just speak from my own experience now, because although I did family medicine for 35 years, now I exclusively do palliative care, mostly end-of-life care. So I've done that for the past dozen years as well. And very often find myself in a room with a family whose relative is nearing the end of life. And sometimes the family is struggling what to do, whether to continue with life support, whether to give another round of chemotherapy, whether to have heart surgery. I mean, these are often big decisions, and often the patient's involved in that decision and sometimes not. But inevitably there's conflict, and sometimes the conflict gets quite heated. And so the tendency most of us have in conflictual situations is our pulse begins to quicken, our breathing quickens, we start talking faster, we don't listen quite as well, we start talking louder, on the one hand, or maybe the opposite, maybe withdraw. But that capacity for self-monitoring and saying, before you begin reacting, to say, okay, this is a tense situation. I'm allowing myself to feel that tension. And rather than pushing it away, rather than spending energy, just being aware that whatever thoughts and feelings are going through my mind are just that, they're thoughts and feelings. And I have choices about how I can act. So in a way, I train myself now when things are heating up in the room, I kind of cool down. Okay. And so, and I think that comes out of meditation training. I think it comes out of the capacity to be aware, but not grasping onto particular thoughts, feelings, emotions. So that would be one example. I think surgeons, I've got a lot of people who've attended the workshops we've read, and a lot of the workshops we've done, and a lot of the correspondence I've gotten has been from surgeons, because if a surgeon is not being mindful, is not being attentive, it's pretty, it pretty quickly. I mean, you cut the wrong thing, something bleeds, it's kind of obvious. If you say the wrong thing, in a way people sometimes don't notice, but you cut the wrong thing, that's trouble. So surgeons, and they know when they're training residents and training surgeons in training, who's paying attention and who isn't, And often that quality of paying attention has more to do with whether you're a good surgeon or not than how good you are with your hands. And so those are just a couple of examples of. I remember as a resident, when someone's heart stops and you're trying to resuscitate it, it's called a code. Everyone rushes into the room. People have seen that on TV, but usually they're kind of chaotic, and people are emotions are running high. It's hard to figure out who's in charge. So just as kind of an exercise, when I was a resident, I really wanted to see if we could create mindful codes. And if by virtue of one person who was running the code not being flustered, of being focused, of having a calm, aware presence, if that would affect the climate in the room. And sure enough, it did. There wasn't as much noise. People weren't sticking each other with needles, which does happen sometimes. You miss the patient, you get someone else. It just all had a certain coherence to it that was not present in other situations. As a family doctor, for patients who had joint problems, sometimes I would do joint injections and inject a shoulder or inject a wrist with sometimes a steroid medication. And again, just the sense of focus of just, imagining in your mind's eye where this needle is going, and just having a sense of unwavering attention, for me, I think contributed to my ability to be more accurate and also not have to try more than once. I think those are all, a variety of ways in which being mindful or more present or more attentive can really help you as a doctor.
And you mentioned earlier that you're seeing more hands go up. Ask people about experience with mindfulness. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you're finding increasing interest in the medical community about mindfulness, because in the past it has been more of an experience of resistance to what's not been seen as hard science, and that seems to be shifting. And I wonder what your experience is.
Yeah, no, I don't see resistance to the idea very much. I mean, people are aware that this is something that can be helpful. They're aware that there's a literature, and the resistance I see is, I don't have time, or I can't do it. I get too distracted, I get restless. And, it's kind of funny. People will say, I can't do mindfulness. Well, I say, well, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a transplant surgeon. Well, do you know how to pay attention when you're in the operating room? Yeah. Well, how do you learn to pay attention? And then it's like, oh, you mean you can actually teach people to do that? I said, yeah, that's what I do. And they say, well, can you sign this resident up for this? But in any case, if you can put it in the vernacular and say, this is what it's about. Have you always been able to be calm when things are going awry? Well, how'd you learn to develop that capacity to be present amid catastrophe and not turn away? And some people will say experience. I say, well, think about all your colleagues. Some of them might have a lot of experience. Are they all equally good at that? Okay, well, then you're born with it. Well, that might be true partially. Some of us might be naturally more or less mindful. I don't make any claims to any heritage in that regard. Anxiety ran rampant in my family when I was growing up. So it's probably true that some people are constitutionally more mindful than others, but that doesn't mean that those of us who are a little slower at it can't learn.
Right. So I'm also wondering what some of the difficulties you may have encountered in communicating about mindfulness. What are some of those challenges you've run into?
I guess I would say that I've been doing it long enough that I have found enough different ways to access different people when talking about the same fundamental idea. So initially I was kind of scared about talking to surgeons or talking to psychiatrists for different reasons. Surgeons, because I thought they would be resistant. Psychiatrists, because I thought they had more of a, well, knowledge and experience with mental phenomena, and maybe I wasn't as good at that. I think starting from stories is the best thing, and then saying, okay, this thing that we're identifying as good practice, or this thing that we're identifying as something that would help a doctor sustain him or herself during a stressful time, let's just call that thing mindfulness for now. Sometimes I call it attention practice rather than mindfulness practice. But I think a lot of it's language and being flexible and trying to start from, it's like all good teaching. You start from where the learner is at, and then you ask them to examine their assumptions. And if they're willing to hang in there with you, you can often communicate an idea. It doesn't work all the time, but I have a sense that one of the problems in the mindfulness community in general is not having a rich enough vocabulary of ways to explain the same phenomena to people whose backgrounds might be quite different from yours.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's one of the difficulties that we encounter in mindfulness teachers who may have a particular background that has
and those words are really great. I mean, Dharma is a great word. Sangha is a great word. It captures more than teaching and community. But community is close enough, or a community of practice is what I would call it. So when people say I can't, when they're trying to figure out a way to bring more contemplative practice into their lives, they say, well, do you have a community? How can you create a community? There's someone you can Zoom with? Is there someone who can just sit at the same time but halfway across town, but at least you're doing meditation at the same time? Those things count for something.
Yeah, and I'd add in, we don't have to mean the exact same thing as what might be in a different context.
Yeah.
Ron, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
I think I assume a lot of your listeners are not health professionals, and some are. So I'll first say a couple of things to the health professionals. Especially now, we are under unprecedented stress. But even before this, the health professions, especially in the US, have been suffering from a kind of alienation that comes from layers and layers of bureaucracy and electronic health records and various other things that we all have to deal with. But just invite yourself to give yourself and your patients a gift. So for the first 90 seconds of each visit you have with a patient, don't look at a device. Don't look at the computer screen. Just ask your patient why they're there and listen. And it might not take 90 seconds, it might take 30 seconds, it might take 15 seconds. But give yourself that, and I say gift because you'll learn something just by allowing that amount of space, just 90 seconds for the patient. And if that's the only mindfulness exercise you do, just say, why are you here? And listen for a little bit. For me, that can be a very powerful practice. And another thing you might want to think about doing is when you go from one room to the next, when you're seeing patients, to think about what you do during that 10 seconds of transition. What happens when you touch the doorknob? How do you clear your mind from what's happened just before so that you can be present and attentive to the patient you're about to see? So those two things, 90 seconds for the patient and then thinking about transitions. As a patient, I think that you can first of all notice when your doctor is being mindful and not. And then when they're not, do things that kindly draw their attention back to you. So say, I'm not sure you heard what I was concerned about, or but be patient, but in a way, recognize that your physician is often maybe distracted. Try to bring to your doctor the things that are most important first. So rather than leaving that thing that you're dreading till the last thing that you mentioned in the visit, bring that forward. And for you, it might be an exercise in mindfulness saying, well, why am I really here? Why did I come today? If there's one thing that I want to have happen in this visit with my doctor or my nurse or physical therapist or whoever, what's that one thing? So there's a Taoist saying to not confuse the one thing with the 10,000 things. Email is the 10,000 things, right? The one thing is why you're here today with me to deal with something that's important. So, so just to try to use that as a mantra, what's this one thing that's most important?
Thank you very much. And for those listening, if you'd like to find out more, I will have a link to Ron's website, ronaldepstein.com, and of course, a link to his book, Attending: Medicine, Mindfulness, and Humanity, our guest today. Ron, thank you so much for being here.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.